Close the door, so that must mean it's official. Must mean it's official. Well, we've come to the end. Some of you may be celebrating. Some of you hopefully will have enjoyed our time together. I know I have. Ezra and Nehemiah, we've been studying. I think we've learned a lot of lessons. Tonight we're going to finish chapter 13. And then I have somewhat of a review that I wanted to share with you. And you've got a handout, and we'll take a look at that. It's more of a reference for what you can go back and look at later online. If you've ever worked with or watched any of the Bible Project videos. But I watched theirs. I'd had some other ideas of things I wanted to do in doing a review, and then I watched the review that they had, and there were some really good things I wanted to pull out of that. So we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail in just a moment. So what we're going to do, we're going to finish chapter 13. We'll look at some high points that we talked about at the beginning of our quarter, and then we'll touch on the handout, and then we'll probably be at the end of our time by that moment in time. So that being said, let's go now to Nehemiah 13, where we left off this last Sunday morning. And I want to go back to a couple of things that we didn't really get to. If you recall, when we talked about this on Sunday morning, we talked about, Nehemiah himself had to go back to Persia, to the Persian king, and talk to him and kind of report on what he's been doing for the last 12 years. I mean, it's a good period of time that's passed. He comes back to the people, and after he's laid out all very, very specific duties that are to be handled and managed by priests, by the Levites, by the assignments that were given as far as the stations they were given, people they kind of got away from it. And what we see and what we were talking about on Sunday is how you've got a scenario where Tobiah is being given a room in the temple. You've got a situation where the Sabbath is being violated. They're strictly going against all the teachings of the Torah that have taken place in the past. You've got Nehemiah, who is I think he's just frustrated, rightly so. He's frustrated. The people are sinning. They're going back to their old ways. The provisions to the singers had not been provided. So they were working in their fields. That was a part of the challenge in working on the Sabbath. None of the things that he had laid out, they were following. And it brought about our discussion on Sunday about how the temple of God was neglected. It was kind of another thing that they did. And we talked about, I think Debbie mentioned this, we talked about when things get in your heart that should not be in your heart, your temple, God's temple, us sacrificing through that temple our lives, that's where things can go awry. And I think that is a great lesson that we can take away from this chapter. And Nehemiah, as he was, certainly following God, he was a man, just like he was human, just like the rest of us. And he had gone through all these challenges to get the people to where they were, and they were going right back to what they had known from the past. They did not have a heart for God, and that was one of the things that we'll talk about at the tail end of our class. Their heart for God was not there. Early on when we saw the temple that was stood back up, was God in that temple like he was in previous times when Solomon had built the temple? He wasn't there. And yet, Nehemiah has recognized all this, and he's trying to push them through, and he's challenging the nobles here in verse 19 17, and then verse 19, he shuts the gate of the wall because they were working on the Sabbath, and he shuts the gate to keep them out. And they were even camping. This is all the merchants that would come from all over. You got to remember now, since they've built this wall, this is a place that everyone wants to come to. If you've ever seen, there's plenty of construction in Nashville these days. Growing up here, there wasn't anything around, but there's a lot of places to go. When something gets built new in Nashville, people are going to flock to it. Well, that's exactly what was happening with the merchants that were coming in on the Sabbath and working. So Nehemiah said, okay, we're going to shut the gate at sundown. No one will be working on the Sabbath, and then we'll open it back up afterwards. Well, the merchants were literally sitting outside the gate. I mean, so there was this continual distraction by man to not necessarily focus on what God's will was, but what man's will was. And we're going to come back to talking about the prayers here in just a second. That there's a prayer in verse 22. But the thing that we didn't get to on Sunday is that in verse 23, we saw this in Ezra. What did the men do? The men of Judah, who had they married? Verse 23. Whoever they wanted to. That's a good answer. They certainly didn't pay a lot of attention, because who recalls what happened in the book of Ezra? What happened in the book of Ezra that was very similar to this? Ezra had to break up a bunch of marriages that were. And why were they broken up? I think it's important here, and even in Nehemiah. What was the problem with them being married to foreign wives? What challenges did that bring?
God told them not to do that because it might lead them away.
Might lead them away. And in this particular section here, it talked about the women, or the children, were speaking half Canaanite and half Hebrew, essentially. You've got a scenario here where literally their origins of their, one parent being from one culture and another parent being from another culture, it's bringing that in together and causing challenges. And women can influence a man real quickly. And I think that's a lesson. I've been very fortunate that I married a godly woman. And I know there's been many times I look back in my life that, probably if she wasn't around, I wasn't going to be doing the right thing. And there's probably many husbands that can say something very similar. And especially when you've got children now that are talking about, at least from Scripture standpoint, they're speaking both languages, if you will. That's the future. We talk about the children of this congregation, and the future that they will be for this body of Christians. The children were important here. And so Nehemiah was recognizing all this, and it was a concern to him. And Nehemiah knew that the current and future consequences of such influences, and he even references King Solomon in verse 26. That's where this all began. And how many years has it been since Solomon was around from this point on? It's been about 500, 600 years since Solomon's even been around. And yet, 600 years, they still can't get it right. I would say we're still not getting it right. In spite of all the lessons we have, we even have the beauty of hindsight being 20/20, and we still get it wrong. These are the lessons I think that we can glean from chapter 13.
Yeah, Miles was pretty serious about this. He beat some of them up, pulled the hair out.
Yeah, and would you say he was passionate about the situation? He was passionate about it through the lens of what God wanted them to do. And so, yes, he was definitely making a point. In verse 28, it says, one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, had married a daughter of Sanballat the Horonite. So I banished him from my presence. Why would he have done that? This is all in the same theme of what we're talking about. And Eliashib, or Joiada, I think that's right. He's the son of who? It says in Scripture. Eliashib, who is the high priest. You've got this continual conflict. He had to throw who I talked about at the beginning of class. He had to throw out Tobiah. He had to throw Tobiah out because he was in an inner room. And here you got Eliashib, whose son has married Sanballat's daughter. It's a continual challenge. And I think the lesson from here is that we're going to be continually challenged in life. We're going to be continually challenged with some of the barriers that are going to get in the way of what God would want you to do. If your year has started off anything like mine, there's been a lot of challenges in the first 60 days. A lot of things we've had to deal with, both from a family standpoint, aging parents, changes in the future coming along soon for my last child. All the things that you just deal with as parents. We can't be distracted, though, in life by what God would want us to do. Yeah, Dan. I think you're right. In verse 30, it does say after that, so I purged everything foreign and assigned tasks to the priests and Levites, making certain that each knew his work. He'd already done this before. He's having to set it back up again, just so that they would know. And I also made sure that the supply of wood for the altar and the first portions of the harvest were brought at the proper times. So if they were doing offerings, they weren't even doing them at the right times that he had assigned. Again, this seems very hard for us maybe to relate in some ways. But the reality is it shouldn't be, because God tells us what we should do in Scripture. Can we try to understand it? Yes. But even if you don't ultimately understand why God wants you to be and follow commands, does it really matter if you completely ever get the understanding of what it means? I mean, at the end of the day, as we always like to say.
Good point, Eric. We don't have to understand the mind of God to obey.
Can we completely understand the mind of God? No.
No, we can understand enough because we have the Word.
Yeah.
And the Word is the revealing of the mystery. But we don't understand the mind of God. And again, you don't have to understand the mind of any king or leader to obey them. And so, we obey. And that's what Nehemiah did.
You you made me think of the word sovereign. I was studying with Tim Beaver a long time ago, and we got to talking about the word sovereign, a sovereign king. It used to be Sovereign Bank. Y'all remember that? There was Sovereign Bank around here years ago. Sovereign means they can make any decision, a sovereign king can make any decision they want. They're the king. That's why. They can make any decision they want. We worship, fortunately, a God, although he can make any decision he wants, he continues to love each and every one of you as his children. I don't think we appreciate that nearly enough. And Nehemiah was a man who made a lot of mistakes, I'm sure. As energized and as focused as he seems to have been over the last 10 plus years, 12 years of this period of time, I'm sure he has a lot of shortcomings. Which brings me to the end of our chapter where I wanted to go back and look at these prayers. You know, when we make mistakes, often we hopefully go to God in prayer, asking for forgiveness, asking for guidance. Help me to get better. Help me to get stronger. And so we're going to look at the 3 prayers that he prayed. And I think it's pretty appropriate, the fact that he had these prayers here in chapter 13, given the fact that I said in the very beginning, he was probably pretty frustrated. I mean, he was obviously pulling people's hairs out, so he was expressing his frustration as well. But there's 3 different prayers that he prays, and so let's quickly take a look at these. The 3 prayers that Nehemiah makes in chapter 13, I think there's significant moments of communication between him and God. Reflecting on Nehemiah's deep commitment to seeking God's guidance and protection, he was looking for favor as he addressed him. And he addresses he's talking about the various challenges and concerns of Jerusalem that are in Jerusalem. And here's some insights. So the first prayer is found in Nehemiah 13, verse 14. This is really Nehemiah's prayer for judgment of righteousness. In this prayer, Nehemiah asked God to remember him for his efforts to reform the priesthood and restore proper worship practices in Jerusalem. Nehemiah expresses his desire for God's approval and blessing for his actions in purging the corrupt elements from the priesthood and restoring the Levitical duties. It even says here that some commentators notes that Nehemiah's boldness in seeking God's recognition and commendation for his leadership and reforms. In verse 14, someone read that for us real quick, if you have it open.
Remember me, O my God, concerning this. Do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, for his service.
We want to be remembered. You know, I think Nehemiah is at a point here where he's come back and he's seeing all this going on, and he knows it doesn't look right. But he's wanting God to remember the deeds that he has done. He's wanting God to remember the efforts that he's put in. Thoughts on this particular verse, and we're going to look at a couple of other prayers that he prayed. All right, let's look at Nehemiah 13, verse. Someone read for me verse 22.
I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy.
Interesting that he's also saying, remember this good deed also. Any thoughts on, and I don't have an answer for this, but anytime you see something repeated in Scripture, at least when I was teaching the kids to mark their Bibles up in class, if you saw something repeat, it was very important to at least take note of. So remember this good deed also, oh my God. In verse 14, he said, remember this good deed, oh my God. Maybe this is just an English major. I was in chemistry, so I don't know. I'm sure there's a word for repetitious words that come along in such a manner. Thank you. See, I knew it would be something.
It's part of his frustration, because he had already done this before, and he's come back, and it's like he never did it. They didn't learn.
Have you ever been in a situation? I think you're right. You ever been in a situation where you've worked all day trying to get something accomplished project-wise, and then one little thing happens, and it all falls apart, and you got to start over the next day. I know early on when computers were first being used, I would type something up. Well, they didn't have autosave, Ryan, or Google save. You had to physically save everything, or you'd lose it all. How many times did I have to deal with that? And that's frustrating. And Nehemiah, in a much grander scale here, has done what he knows to be right according to the old law in setting up this area, and he's having to redo it again. So I think when he says, remember this good deed also, oh my God, it's like, I'm doing everything I can here. Anything else on that particular verse?
I think that this is, when you go back to 21, he talks about, he warns them. He said, if you do it again, I'll lay hands on you. And you can see his frustration. And we all feel this way sometimes, in different circumstances.
Yeah.
Some of us maybe more so.
Yeah.
But you can tell that he probably had some moments here where, he lost control. He lost his temper, or he lost his patience. But then he turns around and he humbles himself before God. He says, please spare me, according to the greatness of your mercy. The thing I love about this book is the last verse. He says, remember me, oh my God, for good. I wasn't perfect. I made a lot of mistakes. But I know I did a lot of good because it was your commands. Just remember me for that. I think at the end of our lives, that's what we're hoping for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've got written down here this prayer in both 22 and in verse 29. Nehemiah repeatedly is asking God to remember his faithfulness. He asks God to remember him for his integrity in leading the people of Jerusalem. He seeks God's favor and protection against those who oppose him and the reforms he has implemented. Nehemiah prays for remembrance, as you were just saying. Remembrance to reflect on his reliance on God's faithfulness and justice in vindicating his servant and preserving the work that's been accomplished. So I think those are all of those are good points related to his prayer here. And then the last one is, again, a repeat of what we've been reading all along in verse 30. So I purged out everything, foreign wives and tasks, to the priests and the Levites, making certain that each knew his work. I also made sure that the supply of wood for the altar and the first portions of the harvest were brought at the proper times. Remember this in my favor, O God. It's a continual prayer. We've seen prayer all throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. That is an overarching lesson that we can definitely take away. So I wanted to spend a little time in looking at these various prayers that Nehemiah prayed.
I have to wonder, as frustrated as Nehemiah was, he could only imagine how frustrated God was. And he didn't want him to be blind to the good things that had taken place.
And we know God's not blind to anything.
Right.
But yes, I think that's from our standpoint, from man's standpoint, we definitely don't want God to be saying or missing what we've done, what we've accomplished. Absolutely.
But it's kind of a pattern for Jews throughout their history.
It is. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, things to look for in Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to talk about some of these. We spoke about these earlier in our quarter. I wanted to kind of give you the dates, and I would have had these up on the board, but it didn't exactly work out computer-wise for me today. So, significant dates. We've talked. The first class that I had on Sunday morning, I went through a lot of kings that kind of led us all the way up from, the beginnings of time, if you will, up until we get to the Persian Empire, and them going into captivity in Babylonian captivity before the Persians took over. So we went through all of those periods of time. In 721 is when they go into Assyrian captivity, 721 BC. Then in 606 BC, you've got the first group taken from Judah to Babylon. No more than a few years later, in 597, the second group of captives are taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. 586, you have the destruction of Jerusalem, and the third group is taken, and that is the last group. And then we have Babylon, who, again, think about God using these kings, using evil empires, if you will, to do his will. Babylon ends up falling to the Medes and the Persians, and then in 536, the first group of captives return under Zerubbabel back to the beginning of our study in Ezra. That was in 536. The temple is rebuilt in between 520 and 516. Then you have to jump forward another 50 years before you have a second group of captives return under the leadership of Ezra. And then in 444 BC, Nehemiah rebuilds the wall around Jerusalem. So literally from 721, where they go initially into Assyrian captivity, to 444 BC is the period of time that we're looking at, where it goes from the divided kingdom status to being in captivity again, just like they were under under Egypt. They've gone back into this state again, except they've been under a couple of different regimes, with Assyria and then with the Persians here in Babylon. And it takes us then going another 300 years before we actually get back to a semblance of what Solomon had. And as I said, we know God did not exist in that temple like he did in the days of Solomon. And it really speaks to, sometimes we have a tendency to not realize the things that God has given us until we mess them up and they're gone. We have a tendency to do that a lot. And we make mistakes like the children of Israel did. So, things that we look for in Ezra and Nehemiah. Only a remnant returned to Jerusalem. God's love and providence for his people. Had it changed? I mean, in 300 years worth of time, from the time they were in even divided kingdom, and they ended up collapsing, both kingdoms collapsed into captivity, God's love and providence was still there all along the way. Prayer. We've talked a lot about prayer. If there's one thing I hope you leave this class knowing, is that important people such as Nehemiah and Ezra prayed. And they prayed to God for remembrance. They prayed to God for strength. They prayed to God to guide them. Those are the things that we need to be remembering. God always fulfills his promises. God's ways are not our ways, which we know that. And we saw that even in the various readings that we had over the quarter. And man's part in God's plan. We play a part. You don't have all the answers, and yes, you're going to run into challenges and problems, but you play a part. And I said a few weeks ago, we can do more. And that's what I hope you've been energized by seeing what Nehemiah was able to do, what Ezra was able to do, what the people were able to accomplish once they focused. We can do more. we can do more spiritually for one another. We can do more spiritually for those that we encounter on a regular basis. These are the messages of Ezra and Nehemiah. So, get your sheets out, and we're going to take a quick look at that over the next 10 minutes or so. Or do we have any more sheets left, or did I run out? I realize I don't have a sheet, so I did not do a very good job of getting my own sheet. So, if you have taught, you may recognize this right off the bat. I had a few people that recognized it. There is a website called the Bible Project. The Bible Project is something that I've enjoyed looking at in the past, and I'd actually looked at some other things to talk about tonight, but they did such a good job, especially putting these two books together, that what I wanted to do is kind of hit some highlights of this. But if you just do a Google search of the Bible Project, Ezra, Nehemiah, there'll be a little video. And if you remember, a few years ago, it got real famous for them to draw quickly and talk you through, and they're drawing it in real time. Go ahead and pull up we're going to try to enlarge this on the screen. I understand it might not be the best, but he's working on that. But they would draw quickly, and so they walk you through the story. So the Bible Project, Ezra and Nehemiah, take a look at that when you get a chance to sometime at the end of the week or over the weekend. They did a really good job with this because it really talks about, from a historical perspective, just starting at the top of the page, you know, the fact that they go, this is back in 2 Kings 24 and 25, where you really have the collapse of what was the kingdom of the children of Israel. And they go into Babylon captivity, you see there from left to right. And from there, you know, the idea was that God's providence was going to allow them to rebuild. And that would take them to reconstructing the walls in Jerusalem and all the things that you see there to the far right at the top of the page. What's really interesting about this, from looking from left to right, now going back to your left side of your page, there is a parallel design, and it talks about, number one, a Persian king moved by God to send a leader to Jerusalem. Then you have a leader who faces opposition. So in each of the cases, whether it be Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, they have a king that gives them direction. Then they face opposition, and then this takes on a little bit of their perspective or opinion. I'm not sure I fully agree on this, but the third thing it says there, it has a strange anticlimax. I can see where they get this, and the anticlimax would be that in Zerubbabel's case, they really don't get to a situation where victory, we've rebuilt the temple and everything's great. It kind of has an anticlimactic ending, is what they state in this particular write-up. You see the same thing with Ezra. You've got, you know, Ezra ending with breaking up families and in the pouring rain. You know, again, not a very. My wife Robin loves to watch Hallmark movies. There's the the guy coming to the small country town, and then the two meeting one another, they fall in love. There's a moment of tragedy where they split, and then they recognize that they shouldn't have done that, and they live happily ever after. Every Hallmark story is the same. She loves them. She loves those because they all have a nice, happy ending, you know, kind of like the Brady Bunch. So you've got a couple of examples here of both Zerubbabel and Ezra where they don't end well, and then we get what we studied tonight on Nehemiah. You know, the ending of this story is everybody's doing the wrong thing after me working on this for 12 years, and I'm just frustrated, you know. So it is very interesting. I had not thought about it until I saw this, that there is some themes there where there's an anticlimactic ending. So let's look at Ezra 1 through 6 here in this first box. Can you get that up there? Yeah, you got it up there. Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel is, Cyrus says, whoever wants to return to Jerusalem, may God be with you. So Cyrus, as a Persian king, that was good for the children of Israel to have him in charge. I mean, to have that type of support, the artifacts and all the things that, Babylon they just totally, trashed them. And fortunately, they were able to collect those again, bring those artifacts, and you see them journeying through. And in verses 3 through 6, they actually start offering, chapters 3 through 6, they offer sacrifices. They finally work on getting the temple built. There's lots of people coming. I think Brother Jack studied, he was doing a lot of the teaching around this. And I think you said it took like 4 months, if you kind of project how long it took to get all these people from Babylon back to Jerusalem. I mean, this is a big ordeal. And so Zerubbabel... Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, but it's the same area, right? It's the same area. So yeah, that's true. Good point. But they get the temple built and people are celebrating. And as I've said before tonight, God was not in that temple, not like he was with Solomon. And so that's why you have old people that are crying and they're in despair over the way it used to be. And then you also have people wanting to be a part of the building process with Zerubbabel. And again, they're running them off. This is not your part of your project again. And that's kind of the way chapter 6 ends. Then you have to go another 70 years before then Ezra comes into the picture. He's coming back with the second group, and he's really going to be focused on teaching the people the law. He's as a prophet, he is teaching people the old law. And he's bringing about an understanding of what that law is. Well, once again, you have people that are intermarried, people that have, clearly not been obedient. And on top of that, you've also got people that aren't going to be allowed to be a part of the process because they're from other nations. And again, the way that Ezra ends there is a process where they're not following what in the book of Deuteronomy or the Torah is actually talked about, the way they should be not intermarried. And you have the ending of families being broken up because they want to do what God would have them to do. They recognize they were in the wrong. And Ezra has made them aware of this. And then that gets us to Nehemiah, where Nehemiah, as very different situation than Ezra, Nehemiah is the cupbearer, right? He's the cupbearer to the king. He's involved in with Artaxerxes. Again, Artaxerxes was part of Ezra's, exodus or, coming back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah is involved as the cupbearer. He's allowed to go back because he sees this as despair. I think he's really upset. And we studied about the fact that from the time he found out from his brother that the walls were still in a disarray until the time he actually went, I think it was about 4 months of prayer that he would have spent before he ever left. We need to spend time with God in prayer. I didn't do that today. I did not pray when I normally pray today. And I can tell. I can tell by virtue of the fact, the way that I feel like I'm rushing you through this class. But spending time with God in prayer is important. And we can't let the day's activities and the hecticness of life get in the way. And so Nehemiah prayed for many months. He finally asked the king to be able to go. He's allowed to go. He has all the provisions to build this wall. And it's just like we talked about, from the day he got there until the day until this chapter ends, he faced opposition constantly. We've talked about all the characters that we've mentioned, Sanballat and others. And this is where chapter 7 ends in a similar way, where Nehemiah is pushing them back and saying they can't be a part of it. You go to chapters 8 through 12 where there's a spiritual renewal. And this is where, again, a good movie, a movie would end with a happy ending. This might be where you think, oh, this is all going to come together great. Again, as we studied over the course of the last few weeks, chapters 8 through 12, it's talking about the confession of sin, the covenant renewal, a vow to follow the Torah, great celebration. You know, they're getting all these things together. It looks like they've got it all lined up. He gets it all set. And then this is what we talked about tonight in chapter 13. He comes back after being gone back to see the king and report on what's been taking place. The temple's being neglected. You've got the Sabbath being dishonored because they're not been given their provisions to eat. They're within sides of the walls, Jerusalem walls, are other merchants. They're trying to sell fish and everything else that is talked about. And as Brother Jack said, there's Nehemiah on the far right. If you didn't know it, he's got hair in his hands where he's pulled somebody's hair out. So, oh God, at least I tried, is what the cartoonist put in the little bubble there. And you know, we kept reading in the prayer of Nehemiah, oh Lord, remember me, remember my tasks, remember the things I've done. This is the way this particular book ends. So it's kind of interesting that these two books in these segments all have this kind of, if you will, ending. Yeah, to Tyler.
Building off of that, the coolest part, and I always forget this because of physically where Nehemiah is in your Bible, you forget that this is the next thing that happens chronologically is the Gospels. You know what I mean? And so throughout the Old Testament, God gave the Israelites the ability to have rock solid borders as far as not influenced by outsiders. An incredible fortified cities, beautiful temple, this huge institution of priests and Levites just making worship absolutely perfect. Like they could have had all this, they didn't, abide by God's agreement, blah, blah, blah. And that's what Nehemiah is lamenting here. The next thing that happens essentially in this chronology is Jesus coming and saying, guess what? Borders no longer matter. You are all now priests. There is no longer a physical temple. And so that is kind of the happy ending, that Nehemiah kind of lacks.
Right.
It's Jesus comes and basically responds to all these things that Nehemiah is lamenting and gives us hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you get a chance to watch this again, the Bible Project, Ezra Nehemiah, take a look at it. It runs for about 8 minutes, I think is how long it runs. It's really interesting. And as Tyler was talking about that, here at the bottom of the page, the idea was, you think about Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're kind of pushing people away. You can't be a part of this. You're not part of God's people. And here at the bottom, it's saying, it kind of goes against what the prophets always talked about. And that is, all nations were going to be saved. All nations were going to be a part of God's plan. Now, had Ezra and Nehemiah allowed those individuals to take part in being a part of the building the temple or building the wall, we certainly know, that's why I kind of have a little, not sure I fully grasp it, because we know, just like we talked tonight, that intermarrying with other nations was not allowed, and they went through great efforts to make sure that it was purified. But I think it does bring us an interesting point. If you look at the bottom of this page where it's got all the people, all nations to be welcome, it begins, the book of Ezra really begins with hope, and it ends with somewhat disappointment. But it's very consistent if you think about it. We as Christians, a new Christian, if you remember the day you were baptized, I remember the day I was baptized, and I remember coming up and feeling different. I don't know if that was just part of me, my mind or whatever, but I knew it was different. And I remember that day. And I started out that day excited, glad to have made the right decision in my life, spiritually, going to do everything I can to live for God every day. I've been a Christian now for 40 years. I've not lived every day for God. And I think that's the part here at the bottom of here. It says it begins with hope and it ends with disappointment. And that's where, while I've been disappointed in the things that I've done, I know that God loves me. And as it was talking about here, the book points to a need for the people to have a new heart. The children of Israel never got that new heart. Yeah, they would have moments of we're here for you, God, and then they would go down. And then they would get in situations where, yeah, we're back, and they're down. You know, this having a new heart for God is the key. And that's where I think the book of Ezra and Nehemiah ends, is giving us that picture of the children of Israel and how we can learn lessons from them over 500 years. Time from the ending of the kingdom to the beginning of the new. And just like Tyler said, that's when Christ comes into the picture for all mankind. So, any thoughts or questions or comments? I've really enjoyed our class. There will be a rerun of this class.